Welcome to another episode of Middle School Music with your hosts. I'm Farhan Lalji, and with me, as always, is Dario Duet. All right, Dario, how are you doing today?
I'm great. It's okay. Let's just do that again because it sounds like I always say that. Sorry. Sorry.
Nice. You got 3 words in, Dario.
I got 3 words in.
All right, let's go again.
Okay, sorry.
All right, welcome to another episode of Middle School Music. I'm your host, Farhan Lalji, and with me, as always, is my good friend and colleague, Dario Duet. Dario, how you doing today?
We're at episode 2, season 3. I'm good. It's raining outside though. It's a bit of a bummer. It should be. It's quite different to the good summer weather we've had up to this point.
I know. The weather is definitely not summer-like in London today, but we've had some glimpses of it, and hopefully we'll get back to it this weekend and next week. But it's kind of like apropos of kind of what's going on in the world. So many of you might be missing your regular fix of middle school music. We just thought with everything kind of going on in the world last week with the Black Lives Matter movement that both of us have supported and are very watching with kind of open eyes and trying to kind of establish and re-examine our own kind of selves. Right now, we just didn't feel like last week was the right time to release another podcast. But yeah, so here we are back again, trying to bring some discussion around music, tech, and finance to the world. Talking about music, though, Dario, what have you been listening to? What's been keeping you kind of sane during this crazy time from a music perspective?
Well, it's been a while. I mean, I was listening to a lot of John Connor. That's if you guys listened to the first episode of season 3. Some of you will be following our Instagram page. That's at Middle School MDLSKL. You'll find some playlist recommendations that we started to put together thematically. Dude, I've been listening to so much, it's actually ridiculous. But one thing I will say I've been listening to a lot of is Machine Gun Kelly's Bloody Valentine. There are
Really?
others that he's been promoting of other artists or kind of unknown artists. He's also put an acoustic version out. I find it really interesting when you can hear other people's perspectives of how they've approached a song. That's pretty cool. But otherwise, actually, workout-wise, been listening to a lot of Future and the older DJ Khaled stuff.
Really?
You know, when they used to do those hip-hop hyper mixes where there'd be like 7, 8, 9 people on a song. Like, there are a couple tracks there with like Kendrick, Lil Wayne, Ace Hood. It's pretty cool. What about you?
So I spent a lot of the last week actually listening to the Run the Jewels new album.
Great album.
Yeah, I mean they dropped it in kind of like really kind of tense times in the world, and it is very, as you'd expect with Run the Jewels, kind of like a great kind of commentary on society. The joke I've been making is they even made Pharrell mad, with that kind of track that they've got with Run the Jewels 4. It's just a great album. So I've been kind of rinsing that a little bit with Zach De La Rocha, and they've got a couple. I was playing Ooh La La with Greg Nice because as an old school hip hop head, Nice and Smooth, that Greg Nice hook kind of was an earworm for me. And then when they released the album, I've been playing a lot of that. There hasn't been a lot of like good new music. So like yourself, I've been kind of like digging in the crates or kind of digging in the search bar on Spotify and going into a little bit more old school hip hop stuff as well. Been listening to a lot of Tribe Called Quest, a lot of like more fun, relaxed kind of hip hop alongside kind of to balance out the Run the Jewel stuff that I've been playing a lot of as well. So that's what I've been listening to. And what's going on in the music world, man? What are we talking about today?
There's so much to talk about in the music world. We could do like a 5-hour episode, but I think something kind of sticking to the core, like we've done with our recommendations, our old school versus new school. I want to bring it back to the concept of music and finance. And I think something that's particularly important to speak about is the Warner Music Group IPO, or the WMG IPO, which was originally postponed from the beginning of March due to COVID-19 and launched on the NASDAQ market on the 3rd of June this year. Now, the reason I wanted to bring it to everyone's attention is because we've been talking so much about digital service providers and Spotify and Apple Music and all of the other market peers. And we talk about their, Spotify struggles or the considerations behind those business models. but Warner Music Group is an incumbent, i.e. it's a label. We've always talked about how labels have struggled. However, there have been changes in the industry, with 3 to 4 years of consecutive growth. And I thought it would be a fantastic discussion point between us, and considering our backgrounds, to understand why the IPO has been so successful and what implications it has on the industry moving forward.
Sounds good. Well, shall we dig in? Why don't you set the scene maybe and tell people a little bit more around the background behind Warner, where it's kind of come from. I mean, most people listening to this probably know or have heard of Warner Music, but they might not know, for example, some of the artists that make it up for, what were some of the assets that went into that, kind of maybe we can start there.
Phew, so much pressure. No. So Warner Music Group is the world's third largest recording company. So it sits behind Sony at second and Universal Music Group at first. Now, Warner Music is a label, or they were originally acquired by Access Industries in 2011, originally held by its former parent company, which is Time Warner. Now, Warner Music Group, they have a variety of subsidiary labels, including the likes of Atlantic, Warner, Elektra, and Parlophone, and includes artists such as Madonna, Ed Sheeran, and Bruno Mars, just to name a few. They have a publishing business, which is very lucrative in today's music climate, with a very big catalog, which includes more than 1.4 million compositions. Now, the interesting thing about kind of Warner Music as a whole was actually that it was listed on the New York Stock Exchange until 2011, and then Access Industries came along and acquired it for around $3.3 billion. And that Access Industries, which also has a majority stake in Deezer, which is a DSP, is led by billionaire Leonard Blavatnik. Now, they have been the majority owner ever since, and kind of back then, the share price was roughly $8 a share, which is a huge contrast to today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great kind of like almost like a private equity type acquisition of a public entity, taking it private, trying to kind of build up the asset itself, seeing the catalog. You mentioned kind of some of the artists. It is kind of one of those, almost old school type labels where they kind of signed big hit artists and promoted the crap out of them in order to kind of like get the value out of their catalog as well, right? And it's interesting to see, kind of Access that wasn't really a big name in kind of music or in media or in private equity, not somebody everybody would know of, kind of coming in, swooping in, buying out the asset, strengthening the business, or at least kind of waiting it out until the market kind of really kind of properly evaluated or valued that business, and then taking it back to public.
Exactly. And I think what's interesting about it is that if you look at the composition of Warner Music in general, recorded music makes up around 80% of their total revenues, which is kind of near almost a $4 billion business. But it's really complemented by the publishing side, which is more than $600 million per annum. Now, publishing, for some people who aren't so familiar with the technicalities behind the industry, it's really where songwriters and composers receive a payment with their compositions when they're used commercially. Now, there are many facets to publishing. So you've got the label publishing group could serve as a publishing administrator, where they administer the copyright. And what I mean by that is that they protect the use of those songs, as well as collect the royalties from them. On the creative side, they focus on, maybe for lack of a better word, exploitation of those songs. So just like we referred to with Hypnosis Songs Fund in season 2, it's kind of using those songs in the likes of film, TV ads, games, etc. And then those creative teams also try and ensure that, they can set up co-writes and pitch songs to artists. I was actually listening to an interview from Candice Pillay, which is actually a fellow South African who moved to LA and worked with Dr. Dre and John Connor on the Compton album. And her big break came from one of her songs actually being used by Rihanna. And then she was kind of brought in by Christina Aguilera to co-write her album, and inevitably led to Dre. That just is a bit of a side note.
It's really interesting. I mean, if we compare, kind of Warner from a publishing and, kind of ownership perspective, and like you said, kind of with kind of a comparison to Hypnosis and how they've kind of managed to grow the value of their songbook, right? I mean, if you take that and you compare it to Universal, right? And how different kind of Warner is to Universal, maybe how similar. But it's really interesting to see kind of the financial instruments that are happening with these kind of big groups that have a big catalog, right? Like with Universal, with their whole Vivendi and the ownership with Tencent and all of that kind of stuff coming together. And we have episode 2, which will release probably around the same time, an interview with somebody from Universal Music with Olivier Robert Murphy as well. So how do you kind of like weigh up or kind of look at a comparison between somebody like WMG and Universal or UMG?
Well, it's insane, actually, and I'm glad you raised this. So, it appears that Vivendi wants to spin out a portion of Universal Music Group in IPO as an IPO by 2023. But there's this, how can I say, puppet master, which is inevitably is Tencent, which is, again, we've spoken about extensively about Tencent, the Chinese music industry in season 1, I believe.
Yeah,
I believe I'm season 1 now. We keep flying through these episodes. And Tencent and really the corporate structure, or should I say the web that's become corporate ownership in the music industry is insane. So, essentially, you've got Tencent Music, right? Tencent wants to acquire 10 to 20% of Universal Music.
Universal, yeah.
All these cents and tens. Anyway, now you've got Tencent Music, which is basically the Chinese version of Spotify, and Spotify own almost 10% stake in one another. Okay. And that was kind of inked in a deal in 2017. Then you've got Tencent, which acquired 10% of talking about this is insane. I mean, if you want to look for a diagram, we'll share Cherie Hu's diagram from Music Water on our Instagram and on our Twitter page. And then you've got kind of Universal Music. You've got Tencent, that wants to and has the option of buying a larger stake in Warner Music Group. And Sony Music may own a share in Tencent. So, I mean, I'm not even going to try and explain this to you. Basically, they rule the world. But actually, no, it seems to be that Tencent's really trying to make active acquisitions in the music and media space. And considering the relationships between digital service providers such as Spotify and Apple Music, the record labels, and the royalty payments, which are essentially affecting profitability for the DSPs, as well as the geographic implications of how that affects their revenues, depending on the phase of the business, it becomes extremely complex, but also very thought-provoking.
Yeah, because it's not like a straight up consolidation in this space, right? It's not like one kind of takes up and owns a majority stake. These are very kind of small stakes in large businesses, but they give you enough in terms of building out that sense of a relationship between these different entities, right? And having some influence, if not control. And I think that's the interesting thing to see, kind of whether it's Sony, whether it's Universal, whether it's Tencent, whether it's Spotify, the relationships. And I would recommend that people kind of look at the diagram that we'll hopefully share on our social channels to make more sense of it. But it is really interesting to see how it's not consolidation, but it's consolidated influence that you're seeing in this space, right? That people, the relationships between the entities make it really unclear as to who's a competitor and who's a collaborator, who stands to benefit if one kind of takes more of a competitive stake or wins more. Like that kind of fall-on effect of whether it's Tencent Music, whether it's Universal, whether it's Warner, as they succeed, they're basically helping their competitors or their collaborators or their investors. And in some cases, they're helping all of the above.
Completely. It's insane. I mean, when we look at our podcast analytics for this episode, you're going to just see a huge drop-off rate when I'm trying to explain.
Yeah, try and explain. So let's take it to Spotify, right? And the streaming side. So where do these kind of streaming engines who don't necessarily have the catalog, right, that a Universal or Warner fit, how do they kind of differ, or how do they kind of fit into the whole ecosystem?
Well, it's really hard because the likes of Spotify is still in its growth phase, but it's been in a 12-year growth phase, and it's going to continue to be in that phase. And essentially, despite the fact that you've noticed that a lot of the labels have a percentage stake ownership in Spotify, a large cost component for Spotify sits with the royalty payments. They have to pay the labels. And then there's also the complexities behind the Apple App Store, and there's this ongoing legal case between the App Store and essentially, Apple almost is the gatekeeper
Yeah,
for.
so for those who don't know, like Apple through its App Store takes a 30% cut of all revenues earned through the app
It's insane.
environment, right? Which is why like companies like Spotify and Amazon and even smaller companies, there's a company or a mail product called Hey.com as well that's kind of coming into that space right now that they're all trying to fight with kind of Apple's being the gatekeeper and then also kind of monopolizing and monetizing all the different revenue that the app makers make. And Spotify fits into that, right? Where you've got a competing brand like Apple Music in the natural kind of Apple environment. And then Apple is also cannibalizing your revenue as you come out.
But that's the only actual kind of relationship that Apple has with any of the players in that web we spoke about earlier. If you were listening attentively, you would realize that actually we haven't mentioned Apple at all, aside
Yeah.
from this consideration, which is interesting as well. Now, taking back to your question, for Spotify, royalty payments make up 70% of their revenues. They last year kind of clubbed together with Google, Amazon, and Pandora, SiriusXM, to try and appeal a decision which was set to raise songwriter and publisher royalty pay by 44%, which is huge, which would, again, affect the revenues even further. So, but the question is it contradictory? Because Spotify, so it seems, with their recent set of acquisitions in the podcasting space, they're trying to transform podcasting from an industry built around kind of open standards and traditional advertising into what we've very familiar with as a platform economy. Now, I guess the data would suggest that it's slowly starting to change in terms of people's listening preferences. Now, COVID aside, there's an NPR study based in the United States which mentioned that 80% of people listen to music and 20% it's spoken word audio. That was in 2014. 5 years later, it's shifted to 76-24. And Spotify's made this boom of acquisitions, which I can go into in a second.
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones that people will kind of know of and have heard of. I mean, Gimlet was really kind of one of the first kind of podcasters that kind of spun out of an NPR kind of background as well with their kind of Reply All podcast and others. The sports side with Bill Simmons. The big one has really been kind of Joe Rogan, right? That, where they're getting that exclusivity side. And it's really interesting to see how podcasting and that evolves, right? Like from, our friend and colleague, Dave Galbraith, who kind of worked on some of the RSS stuff in its early days, which is kind of the underlying kind of infrastructure that's used to kind of get people to see when there's an update in content, right? From a podcasting perspective. And now owning the pipes and saying, okay, well, it'll be really interesting to see if Joe Rogan, how much he changes as he evolves and becomes purely on the Spotify platform, if that's kind of going to be the thing that they end up doing. And it's really interesting, and kind of like if you go back to Sirius XM and their kind of deal with Howard Stern, he's continued to kind of like kind of grow his listener base or change his kind of MO, and it'll be interesting to see if Joe Rogan follows a similar path but with Spotify instead of Sirius XM.
Well, I mean, the Rogan deal couldn't have come for a better time for Joe Rogan, because we've seen that advertising dollars are now lower than ever because of COVID. They're predicted to continue to decline or stay low for quite a long period of time, which would particularly hit the ad revenue that he would see from the likes of YouTube. And so the Spotify deal kind of is a great hedge. I mean, he's got almost 100 mil from it. It's funny because he said back a couple of years ago, almost 2 years ago, we spoke to Aerosmith Steven Tyler about this, and basically, I guess publicly, made his opinion very public that he doesn't see a point in being on Spotify for whatever reasons. We'll really go into that. But I think the beauty of this deal is essentially not only does he become the highest paid broadcaster in the world, but essentially it gives Spotify really great access to data, which helps to frame its and justify its advertising business, which they feel will form quite a large component of their podcasting platform as they build out, to try and create some point of differentiation from every other DSP, which focuses purely on music.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if you see consolidation beyond kind of audio, right? Like, so for me, the really interesting play here is, do we see, traditional and non-traditional visual mediums come in and start to kind of play a game the audio side? So Netflix, who's got like a healthy balance sheet, who's seen kind of subscription numbers grow, who has the value on that, do they get into the consolidation and do they branch out beyond kind of video content, right? In the same way that Spotify's branched out beyond kind of music into audio. Do we see more consolidation in media in general, or do we see just kind of the reliant kind of consolidation in just the audio format as well? That'll be one to watch in terms of how much more consolidation. And I think going back to your earlier point around the timing of the Joe Rogan deal, I don't think you can underweigh just how important kind of the COVID situation has become, right? As kind of ad revenue does kind of decrease dramatically. I would have bet that had Ringer, had kind of Joe Rogan, had some of these kind of media new emerging brands stayed independent, they would have seen their revenues drop. And in the short term, sure, they probably would have seen their valuations decrease dramatically. And there's never a better time to kind of pick up an acquisition than when the acquiring company is seeing a dramatic drop in their revenue. And so you can come in and get it on the cheap, right? So while these deals look like really big right now, it'll be really interesting to see whether we look at them in 10 years' time and see them kind of like what people thought of, Google buying YouTube, right? And seeing how much it changed the media side. Or will we look back and see it as, kind of Yahoo buying Delicious, right? It's like, an older media brand kind of buying something that's on its way out. It'll be really interesting to see how those things evolve and whether, kind of getting acquired, getting a chunk load of capital means that they invest in their brand, or does it mean that actually the brand kind of wears over time?
It's a super good point. I mean, I like what you mentioned there, or all of it, but I mean, taking it to the Netflix thing, like it would be great to see, we started to see more documentaries. You got the Michael Jordan documentary and certain artists put under the spotlight, a bit like, MTV. Remember MTV? It's funny we say that, but I mean, I haven't said that word in ages. I mean, aside from the award shows, it's like, where do they sit in all of this? Anyway,
on that documentary point, the Michael Jordan documentary is a really interesting one because that's where kind of media overlaps, right? So you had the documentary itself, and then ESPN and Disney were able to spin out so much content in a time where people were desperate for sport. You had podcasts around the after show, right? So you see, okay, we're going to kind of put out the media in terms of the documentary itself, but then you have the making of kind of with the director coming onto a podcast every week as the episodes were dropped. And so you get media content from a podcast perspective alongside that. And I wonder if that's what we're going to see, right? You get kind of like this content where it's like a 10 series episode where you're looking at, for example, the Biggie Tupac murders, right? And then you're having kind of podcasts around that alongside on the same brand, in the same way that you've got The Last Dance with the Michael Jordan documentary. And I wonder if that's what, kind of this media consolidation will then kind of enable bigger brands like Disney with Disney Plus, ESPN, and others to kind of consolidate. And I wonder if Netflix will do something similar.
It's a great point. I mean, I never thought about it like that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, media is media, right? And I think it's one thing and that's why when we were kind of starting middle school, we were kind of contemplating, do we take the music out of it? Do we focus on media in general? Or do we look at kind of middle school as a music brand? And, kind of now we're talking about audio and how podcasts relate to music, streaming services as well. But it does go beyond, and it does touch other media as well. When you can kind of create content in a way, you are content creators, you are content distributors, you are content channels. Right. And I think that's what these players are trying to become.
Thinking about that, actually, I would love to see, remember you hear about artists who would release a music video for every song or whatever it may be. Like, we've learned that exclusivity with a DSP is particularly challenging. And I know that was the whole idea with the Beats Music, Jimmy Iovine relationship. And it flunked out with Katy Perry's kind of thing. Is kind of almost you make a Netflix type show. It's almost like a movie type thing.
Yeah,
where you can, it's almost like a musical, but it's someone's album, because a lot of albums are starting to go back to concepts or they're thematically relevant, which is pretty cool. Because remember, I've said to you, like, I feel that's critically important uh, to getting people to listen to a full project these days in a kind of single song environment.
Yeah.
So it'd be great to see something like that, but who knows what's really going to happen. No
Do
one
you
has a
see,
crystal ball.
do you see any of the other kind of players? I mean, we've talked about UMG potentially going public
Hmm.
as well. Do you see any other? I mean, it'll be really interesting. I mean, a lot of talk has been about like Amazon and AWS, right? And I wonder if like Apple and the iOS environment or the App Store, plus kind of like Apple Music, right? Now we've seen some consolidation. I wonder if there's some kind of conversation around, how do you separate out these things because they are anti-competitive, and I wonder if there are other players that will come in to kind of like create more competition in these spaces.
It's a good point because Apple Music. I mean, I don't know. Everyone's got a different opinion on it, but I don't think it's that great.
Yeah.
The podcasting side, they started to now make some acquisitions as well. I guess they've woken up to what Spotify is trying to do. I know not necessarily in terms of IPOs, but I know that Tidal has been the first now to make a concerted effort to incorporate kind of Dolby superior sound and an enhanced listening experience for its users, which is something that many who I've spoken to in the industry have felt is lacking and would be a good point of differentiation moving into this hyper competitive environment. I don't think that's really enough I mean, it's like Blu-ray versus DVD, or whatever it was,
I mean, you could even take it back to like, yeah, you could even take it further back to VHS and Betamax, right? Like the superior technology isn't the one that always wins.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I don't really know, like, if that's really going to do much for them. But who knows?
I guess we'll see. I mean, it sounds like there's, kind of some really interesting innovation from a financial markets perspective in the music space, and kind of taking in the streaming as well as kind of the label and the publishing kind of side of things. It'll be really interesting to kind of watch how these kind of companies perform as public entities, if they become kind of like, resting on their laurels, or if they're able to kind of continue to innovate and kind of change the way publishing and distribution kind of continues to evolve.
Totally. On that record, no, it's actually, I see EMI has made a resurgence from the dead this week.
Can't
So,
kill them. Can't kill them. They're still around. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how the labels, the publishers, the old school labels, the new school labels, the distributors, the channels like Spotify and Tencent and Apple, kind of and Tidal, how they all like combine, to kind of like create, a better user experience, right? Getting access to all of these artists, all this content, as a user, you really benefit. But will they be able to really kind of create the value for shareholders? That will be the interesting thing to watch.
who knows? Anyway,
that was a pretty good conversation around kind of the financial element and the evolution on that side. What's next for you, Dario? What do you got going on? What are you looking forward to from a music perspective?
Oh, it's actually gone kind of quiet again. So it seems maybe it's the calm before the storm. I think you've seen. Kendrick Lamar was meant to release his PG Lang album, and that whole kind of campaign has gone quiet. But there doesn't seem to be much going on. I mean, I don't really want to give them publicity, but this Tekashi 6ix9ine thing is particularly interesting. I don't think in today's environment that you can correlate social media popularity to music quality. Because despite the fact that you're breaking other people's records, it's got nothing to do with your kind of lyrical musical talent. It's just got to do with how much crap you talk on social media.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing about like getting the following, right, and then being able to monetize that following versus actual quality music.
Yeah,
right? I think those are definitely kind of things, and I wonder if how much of it is stuff getting shelved because of the current kind of socio-political environment that we're in. Also with COVID as well, like so artists could release music, but then there's no way to actually tour off the back of that, and then the timelines for that. I mean, we're going to see kind of a massive change in terms of concerts and how concert venues and how music is actually promoted from a live experience perspective. And I wonder if we're seeing some of the impact of that uncertainty on kind of how music's being released right now.
Have you, do you know one thing which is really cool actually, and I don't know if I've told you this, is if you go onto an artist's Spotify page and they've got a recent album release, they've always got an accompanying playlist of all the tracks that they felt influenced their sound for that album, which is really, really cool. Because then when you listen to that, not only is it nostalgic, but also brings back kind of, when you're listening to the album, where you see where those undertones sit from, where did they gather inspiration from?
That's a really interesting. I mean, we've talked in the past about how like new albums also create like more streams of older back catalogs.
Yeah.
But if you can use the new album release as a way to create more streams altogether, and it'll be interesting to see, like, as the main conversation we had today, you know, how labels take advantage of that, you know, kind of curating and creating playlists that are kind of fixed on kind of labels to increase their kind of volume of publishing revenue that they get from their other artists that maybe played an influencing role. So can you create more value from the back catalog from a new artist doing a new release? Well, really, really interesting. So I think that's a good place to wrap.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't want to, I mean, there's actually so much industry news, but at a very surface level, and we don't want to become any entertainment. Yes. So we can keep it nice and sterile in the form of finance for today, depending on which way you look at it.
Indeed. But with that, we'll say thanks again for listening to another great episode of Middle School Music. I've been your host, Farhan Lalji. You can find me on Twitter at Farhan Lalji. And Dario, where can the good listeners find you?
You can find me on either on our Instagram page, actually, that's at Middle School, MDLSKL, where you can find cool playlist recommendations and other weird stuff. Or on Twitter, that's at Dario_Devet with a W.
All right. And thanks again for listening, and we'll see you guys soon.
Cool.
Ciao.
Ciao.